on my end, so I'm going to go ahead and get us going. So welcome everybody. My name is Jessica. I'm the program manager for Greensboro Bound. For those of you who were not with us last week, today we have Tessie Castillo, who is the co-author of Crimson Letters, Voices from Death Row. She was the inspiration for this series. And then our special guest today is Dr. Frank Baumgartner, who is the Richard J. Richardson Distinguished Professor of Political Science at UNC Chapel Hill, and he's also the author of Deadly Justice, a statistical portrait of the death penalty. And then in addition, in about 15 minutes, we'll have one of Tessie's co-authors, Terry Robinson, will be calling in from death row to speak with us. So just to let you guys know, so Terry only gets about 15 minutes at a time. So once his time is up, you'll hear like a recorded voice, and then he has to call back. So there'll be a little bit of a lag in our communication with him, but just hang on. Tessie will have him back on the line. So let's go ahead and get this going. So our topic today is one that I think is pretty timely in this period that we're currently living, and that is, should police who kill unarmed citizens get the death penalty? That's a pretty loaded question. So in the aftermath of the murders of Ahmaud Aubrey and George Floyd at the hands of police, at the hand of police and armed vigilantes, some people, including the victims' families, have called for the death penalty. Is this justice? We're going to talk about this today. We're going to talk about capital punishment. Dr. Baumgartner here is the expert on this topic. But first, Tessie, for those who weren't with us last week, if you could just give us a little background about your work and how Crimson Letters actually came to be, to kind of fill everybody in.
Sure. Thanks for hosting again. I'm excited to be back. So Crimson Letters came back almost entirely by accident. I think that most good things happen by accident. I was at a Super Bowl party in 2013, and I was hanging around near the food, and a man walked over and we started talking. And it turns out that he was a prison psychologist who worked specifically with men on death row at Central Prison in Raleigh. So I got really interested and was asking him a lot of questions about his job and what is it like and what are the guys on death row like. And he told me that there had been a change recently at the prison. Previously, no volunteers or outside people were allowed inside of death row. It was very closed off to the public, very hidden. But that year, for the very first time, a new warden had come on, and he was allowing volunteers into the prison to teach different classes. They had writing classes, yoga classes, art classes, restorative justice classes. And so I asked if I could teach a writing class. And I applied and I got into the prison and I started teaching about 24 guys. And I just found it was just a completely transformative experience. I went in with all these stereotypes. I had a lot of, I would say, morbid curiosity about people on death row, and I walked away from that just feeling that there was so much redemption on death row, and there was so much insight from the men who I had met, and humility. And so I wrote a letter to the News and Observer, the local newspaper here, and it got published. I basically said that the people on death row are more than we think they are. And that they defy all of our stereotypes. And I was kicked out of death row for doing that, and my class was canceled. So I started corresponding by mail with several of my former students, and we put together Crimson Letters, which was published in March. And I'm so proud that we made it to this point. So thank you for calling in. I think you're on mute.
I was, yes, I had myself muted. Thank you, Tessie. So this is Tessie's book. There we go. Wait, so it's not blown out. So if you haven't picked up a copy of this, I highly recommend it. You can get it at Scuppernong Books here in Greensboro. Each of the sections are from each of Tessie's 4 co-authors. And again, today we're going to be speaking with Terry. It's really great. All of the essays, each of the men have a very different personality and kind of a different tack with their writing, but they're all very powerful and insightful, so I highly recommend this. So we're going to go ahead and move on to Dr. Baumgartner. So if you could tell us a little bit about your background and what initially got you involved in researching the death penalty.
Well, sure. And let me also say thanks for organizing this, and thanks to Tessie for writing such an interesting and important book to really humanize and let people know about the people behind the bars that we're otherwise not familiar with. I've been a political scientist for almost 40 years, and I've studied all kinds of public policies, and in particular, my long-term interest has been how policies change and how advocates try to reform public policies. And in the year 2000, I got a phone call by somebody who was working on a policy, and he asked me if I could help and come to Washington and give a talk to his organization about how to reframe the policy. And I said, well, what's the policy and what's your frame? And he said, well, the policy we're interested in is the death penalty, and the frame we're trying to push is that it's a government program run by bureaucrats. And because it's run by bureaucrats and it's a government program, it's very inefficient. It's prone to cost overruns, inefficiencies, and mistakes. So I just thought that was a really interesting frame, and I had never thought about the death penalty in those terms, but of course, I think he's right. It's certainly, it's a government monopoly. The defense attorneys are public defenders, the prosecutors are state employees, the judges are state employees. So it's an entire system run by the state, and it's a mess. It's a complete catastrophe in terms of how it's administered, how unfair and arbitrary it is. So anyway, after that initial conversation, I decided to organize a research project to see if that frame was developing greater currency in public opinion and in the media. And I wrote a book about that. It was published in 2008, and it was really targeted on the issue of framing the death penalty around the concept of innocence. And the idea of innocence with regards to the death penalty is that we might execute somebody who had not committed the crime, who was actually innocent of the crime, and how terrible that would be. And of course, nobody's in favor of that. But that when you think about the possibility of executing an innocent person, it raises the question of how many would be too many for you to no longer support the death penalty, even if for religious or philosophical reasons you might think it's a valuable policy, which, by the way, I don't, but a lot of people do. But nobody supports killing innocent people in the name of the government. Anyway, after I got involved in that project, I got just kind of drawn into broader studies of the death penalty. And whenever you study something involved with criminal justice, you have to get very familiar with poverty, race, gender, and identity in general. And so I've followed up on that book with another book about the death penalty and other research on traffic stops and racial disparities of all kinds in the criminal justice system. So although I didn't start out as a criminologist, I've become fascinated with the various flaws and foibles of the criminal justice system and our inability to do things fairly.
So through the course of your research and your involvement, what has surprised you the most about the death penalty?
Well, it's kind of hard to pick. I could give you my top 10 or something. I mean, it's so shocking when you actually count up the numbers and look at how it really works. I could tell you a few. One is that 10% of all the executions in the modern period of the death penalty, that is since 1976, 10% of all the executions have been in Houston, Texas. The crimes for which the person was executed occurred in Houston, Texas. Furthermore, your odds of being executed for a crime in 2015 are probably 1/10 of the odds of being executed for the same crime in 1995, which was about the peak period of the use of the death penalty. Another fun fact that is shocking, 70% of all death sentences are overturned on appeal. So the person is solemnly told by a judge that you are hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection for a horrific crime. And then maybe 10, 12, 15 years later, the state comes and sends a memo, or your attorney comes to your cell and says, you know, they're just kidding. They're not going to do that anymore. So the element of torture associated with the death penalty is just astounding. Fewer than 15% of people sentenced to death are actually executed, which is a good thing, except when you think about the process of going through condemnation and life on death row, expecting that at any minute you might get that date for death. And another thing related to that I think is shocking, among those people who get an actual date, a warrant for their death that the governor signs and then sets a specific date, usually 60 to 90 days out in the future, a majority of those dates are canceled. So I could go on, but I think that's enough to give an idea that the practical realities of the death penalty are quite shocking.
Indeed. I know last week when we spoke with Lyle, one of his essays, I think it's titled Learning to Die, was he spoke about all of his friends and mentors and people that he had seen die since he had been on death row, and that constant kind of, you know, constant psychological stress of watching people die, and it basically being arbitrary. Somebody just calls up a number and that's the date all of a sudden. But
I should add that Lyle's experience on death row was that he came to death row, I believe, in 1999. And so the first 7 years or 6 years that he was on death row, the state of North Carolina really was carrying out executions, as many as, I think, 6 in 1 year in 2004. But we haven't had an execution since 2005. And so it's almost been 15 years since there's been a moratorium. So I can't imagine how terrible it would be to have to go through that process of seeing somebody, you know, one of your close friends or, you know, acquaintances pulled out of the common room and taken away to the death chamber and never to come back. But that isn't happening in North Carolina anymore. We have a moratorium.
All right, I'm gonna switch back over to Tessie for just a second. So Tessie, I think that you covered this in your introduction, kind of how Crimson Letters came about. It was the birthed from the class that you had, the journaling class that you had, and then how you had to continue corresponding once you were removed as a volunteer. But specifically with writing this book, what are you looking to accomplish? What do you hope that people will learn from reading the book and hearing these stories?
Sure. Basically, the point of Crimson Letters is to pull the veil back a little bit on who's on death row. Before I went and volunteered there, I had no idea who was on death row, how many people were there, why they were there, where they came from. And being able to meet them and have that privilege of being able to form those relationships, I want other people to see what I saw. I want them to witness the humanity that's on death row. And I want that to happen through the voices of the men themselves, not through just my voice. And that's why in the book, the men write their own sections, and they're all incredible, incredible writers. And so they tell their own stories, and I want to be able to provide them with a platform to tell the world who they are, so that whether you're for the death penalty or against it, I think it's important that we know more about it, that we know who we're executing and why, because otherwise it's just sort of this secretive thing that happens. And I don't think something that serious should be a secret. I think the public should know, since it's being done in our name.
So this next question, I'm going to direct it back to you, Dr. Baumgartner. And I think we're going to start to get into the heart of our topic and our discussion with this question. So after the recent deaths of Ahmaud, Aubrey, and George Floyd, their family members have called for the death penalty for the people who are responsible for their deaths. Do you think that the death penalty is appropriate in these circumstances? And is that even possible, considering it was law enforcement that carried out these deaths? Is it even possible for them to receive the death penalty?
Well, without getting into the politics of whether it's likely to happen, I could say Minnesota doesn't have the death penalty. So nobody gets the death penalty in Minnesota. And I would also say that that's a good thing, because the death penalty is an extremely flawed system that, even if you like it in theory, if you understand how it works in practice, you can't like it. So no, I don't believe that anyone deserves the death penalty. And there is no chance that police officers are going to get it, and the state of Minnesota doesn't have it anyway. So it's, but with regards to what's the appropriate punishment, and how much immunity should a police officer have, should there be two standards of justice? No, there shouldn't be two standards of justice. There should not be the kind of immunity that we see today, which is virtually absolute immunity for a police officer. No, there has to be some kind of opportunity for real justice when somebody kills somebody. I mean, this individual, from what it appears with George Floyd, I mean, literally suffocated him. And from what I understand, knew him ahead of time. So it could very well have been a premeditated opportunity to exact vengeance. So I'm all in favor of justice, but I don't believe the death penalty serves any purpose of justice.
So how do you think that how do you think that law enforcement can get past hanging on so tightly to qualified immunity? I know that there have been, every police chief that's been interviewed has said, absolutely not, we're not going to give that up. That wasn't on the table with the new, I don't know what it was, whatever President Trump did this past day to kind of, in an effort for police reform, qualified immunity was absolutely not on the table. So how do we break through that and break down that double standard that exists? I
think the real issue is not whether, people don't unilaterally and without prompting voluntarily give up power. And qualified immunity is a great area of power for police officers, and it gives them the freedom to engage in behavior that the rest of us would be punished for, and they can go without punishment. So it's not likely that anyone would give up such a power voluntarily. But you think about how dramatic policy changes happen. I would just point in another direction, and that's gay marriage. 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, certainly nobody would have even imagined that that was something that you could even talk about realistically. And today it's the law of the land. And not only is it the law of the land, but Justice Gorsuch just penned another Supreme Court decision that extends the rights of gays and lesbians and transgender individuals to be protected from employment discrimination. So I do think that change comes from these cultural shifts in our understandings of what is right. And it used to be that people thought it was right to be able to freely discriminate against people on the basis of gender orientation. And today, 6-3 majority of the Supreme Court thinks that's not right. And so qualified immunity might be one of those ideas that's about to shift from something that people don't think about. Only experts consider it. And all those experts are police officers and legal officials who are protected by it themselves. And members of the public have been long unaware of the importance of that qualified immunity statute and understanding of the court. And now that people are really drawing attention to it, it's almost like the emperor has no clothes, and people may shift their opinions, and cultural expectations could very well change in a way that's kind of analogous to what we've seen with gay rights.
So most people think that the death penalty is reserved for the worst of the worst. Is this true?
Absolutely not. First of all, some states have it, some don't have it, and crimes occur everywhere. Secondly, within a state, some counties use it and some counties don't use it. And that's because the prosecutor gets to decide. And some prosecutors happen to be more aggressive in their use of the death penalty than others. And for no good reason other than the personality of the prosecutor or the politics of that particular place. For example, Houston, Texas has a lot of executions, but Atlanta, Georgia, that it's not you know, some liberal bastion, certainly throughout its history, but Atlanta has had very few death sentences and executions, and Houston has had a lot. So explain that to me. The crimes are not particularly worse in Houston than in Atlanta. It's not like one is a northern liberal city and one is a southern conservative one. So it's quite capricious. The other thing is, when the victim is a white female, the odds of a death sentence are much, much higher, in particular if the perpetrator is a black male. And so those kind of ugly vestiges of the lynching culture in the South remain apparent in the death penalty. So on the one hand, it's just weird and capricious and totally random and unexplainable. On the other hand, to the extent that there are any kind of observable biases, it's a really ugly legacy of lynching and racial dynamics in the former Confederate states.
Yeah. I'll say that just this past weekend, my husband and I watched 13th. It was a documentary that actually came out about 4 years ago about the 13th Amendment. And it was incredibly eye-opening and powerful. And for those of us in our audience, I highly recommend that you take some time and watch that documentary. It's on Netflix, and I believe it's actually also available on YouTube for free. So again, it's called 13th. It's really good, and I think it will definitely open a lot of eyes to just that racial disparities and how I don't want to necessarily call it slave culture, but just how that part of our history has just permeated all through the criminal justice system in ways that is really kind of mind-blowing, and how it continues to persist. So I wanted to get back to Tessie for a second. So before you began your journaling class, you researched the crimes of the inmates. Why did you do that? Why did you want to know? And did you find anything there that surprised you?
Yeah, I did it because I was curious. I think a lot of people are curious. I had the same idea about death row that most people have, which is that it's some elite force of people who've committed especially gruesome murders, the worst of the worst. And I was just curious. So I researched it. And the thing that shocked me the most was finding, even just from looking at what the crimes were, how untrue it was that they were the worst of the worst. It is true that there are some people on death row who are there for some particularly gruesome murders. But two guys in my class, just to use an example, two guys had never killed anyone at all. In one case, the man was the getaway driver for a robbery, and there were other people involved in the robbery. They hadn't intended to kill anyone. But during the course of the robbery, one of the guys shot, I believe it was a clerk who worked at the store. And the outcome of that was that the man in my class, the student who had been the getaway driver, who had been outside of the building and had not even participated in the shooting, he got the death penalty. Whereas the other three co-defendants, including the one who had actually shot the clerk, none of them got the death penalty. And so I saw things like that were just bizarre. I mean, how could you give the death penalty to the getaway driver and not to the shooter?
I'll tell you how.
I know, you could speak.
The shooter is going to go to the police first and plead guilty to get lesser charges and throw his friend under the bus. That's how you're going to do it. And that happened. We've executed 16 people in our country that never pulled the trigger.
Yeah. So I saw things like that even in my own class, and it was shocking to me. And so I researched it, and I would highly, highly recommend Dr. Baumgartner's book, Deadly Justice. It was incredibly helpful to me in researching this book, into looking into the mechanisms of the death penalty and understanding the mechanisms of it and its flaws. So that was something that I feel like more people should know, because I think most people think that people on death row, they must deserve to be there. They must have done something absolutely horrible and worse than other people in prison. But that's not true necessarily.
Yeah. So I'm going to direct these next two questions to Dr. Baumgartner because at 4:30, Terry is going to call in. So I think we can take up maybe our next 5 minutes or so so that Tessie can do that. So one of the most shocking statistics mentioned in both Tessie's book and yours is that 65% of the people who receive death sentences eventually have their sentences overturned. In North Carolina, 71% of death row prisoners are eventually removed from death row and are given a reduced sentence or released. So with the keeping in mind that if these people are not the worst of the worst, how did they get there anyway? And then their sentences are overturned. How does this happen within this system?
You know, it's really hard to imagine whether when I started thinking about the death penalty as a research topic, I was pretty confident that because of the stakes of the matter, and the quality of the attorneys involved and the importance of the issue at hand, which is literally life or death, you would think that courts would want to make sure to get it right. But I think actually it's the opposite. Because of the stakes, they're so politically important for the prosecutor, and the judges are careful. In many states, judges are elected, and they're careful to appear to be tough on crime. And if a case goes to capital trial, it's a highly emotional case. The district attorney has decided that that's a case that merits such a high profile and severe punishment, and it will definitely get more media coverage if it's a capital trial than if not. And the emotions are just so high that I think people cut corners. They want to make sure to get that conviction. And also in North Carolina, until 2001, the defense attorneys were appointed by the judge, and they simply had to be a member of the bar. They could have been a divorce attorney as their professional specialization up until 2001, when there was a really important and very progressive reform that mandated that 2 attorneys be appointed through the Indigent Defense Services, which is a statewide organization that was created only in 2001. About 70% of death row inmates today on North Carolina's death row are, like our guests, I think, came in before 2001. Shanton came in before 2001, and so his trial was not subject to these safeguards that we've put into place today. And the safeguards all came because of reforms associated with the discovery that we had innocent people on death row. Not just people who were overcharged or oversentenced, but people who actually had not committed the crime and who were exonerated. And in North Carolina, we've had over 35 high-profile exonerations, including, I think, 7 or 8 from death row, including Leon Brown and Henry McCollum, who both were sentenced to death at age 15 and 19 for a crime that they didn't commit and for which they spent over 30 years. Leon on death row, though, just for a short time, and Henry McCollum, his older half-brother, the entire time on death row. And they had not committed that crime. And they've been exonerated and declared to be innocent and have received compensation. So some people are actually innocent, they're exonerated, but you know, the majority of people are found to have been overcharged. And you know, you can't get a federal judge or a state Supreme Court to reverse your death sentence because somebody put the paperclip on the wrong side of the paper. They have to discover a serious flaw, and generally it's prosecutorial misconduct. It's a serious flaw. Either it's the prosecutor failed to hand over certain bits of evidence, so a Brady violation, or the judge gave the wrong instructions to the jury about how to consider mitigators and aggravators, for example. But you can't have your death sentence overturned for a trivial reason. It has to be a material reason that's an important one. So it's a very high bar, and yet 70% of people nationwide and in North Carolina have risen above that bar. So it's shocking, and it's a waste of money, and it's a waste of time, and it's brutalizing to the individual who's sentenced to death, only to find out later that that death sentence itself will be overturned. Then I should add one other complication that adds to the irony and the brutality of it. After your death sentence is overturned, a large number of people get a second death sentence, and then that gets overturned. And there's one case in North Carolina that you can see on the website from the Department of Public Safety. A person who was sentenced to death, it was overturned. Sentenced a second time, that was overturned. Sentenced a third time to death, and then committed suicide.
That's incredible. I mean, I can't even wrap my head around that. So I just have a question about, speaking of prosecutorial misconduct, I kind of lump that in the same category as qualified immunity, because it seems that a lot of prosecutorial misconduct is never rectified, it's not pursued. There is this kind of carte blanche to do whatever, and even if it's, you know, the people who carry that out are never punished in any way. Can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, prosecutors don't have qualified immunity. They have absolute immunity. They have absolute immunity. Yeah. So it's even a higher bar for judges and prosecutors, even higher bar than for police officers. Now, prosecutors, of course, are not like police officers in that they don't carry guns and they're not out on the streets dealing with things, second by second. But they are in the courtrooms, and when they engage in malfeasance, such as hiding evidence from the defense or hiding the fact that they may have compensated a witness, a jailhouse snitch or a jailhouse fabricator, as we call them in the case when there was no crime or it was the wrong person. They fabricate a story and get some leniency from the prosecutor in exchange for that. That needs to be divulged. And when it's not divulged, the case can be overturned, but usually there's no punishment whatsoever to the office of that prosecutor. So that's just how the system works. It's shocking and needs to be changed. There needs to be some kind of accountability, otherwise people have no incentive not to engage in these actions.
Just another piece of the broken puzzle. So Terry is actually with us now. So Terry, can you hear me?
Sure, I can.
Hey there, Terry. My name's Jessica. Thank you so much for being with us today. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and follow that up with what does a typical day look like for you?
Okay, sure. So my name is Terry Robinson, but I'm also called Chanton. I'm from Wilson, North Carolina. I attended Fike High School, but I dropped out after my freshman year. I did further my education, though, at a community college for a while, but mostly what I learned was in the streets. I've spent 20 years on death row so far. I'm 46. I have 3 grandchildren and 3 children and 4 grandchildren. I love to read and write and host role-playing games. And I'm innocent and wrongfully convicted. A typical day on death row. It's a struggle to get through the day. That is the magic of death row, and that is the hardship. Like when you're sitting in this space idly with nothing to do, that can be cruel and unusual punishment itself. So for the most part, I've seen men go throughout death row just trying to purposefully find distractions. Anything just to take the edge off the idea that we are scheduled to die.
So how do you spend most of your time, Terry? What do you do to try to get through those days?
So myself, my typical day is I would get up for breakfast, and throughout the day we have an hour for recreation, and that varies. And between those times, child time and recreation, I usually am kind of stored away in my room, just writing or reading. There are times where I do attend social gatherings out in the day room because I believe that in that community effort. So I attend tabletop games or watch a television show here or there. But the majority of my day, it really truly is spent alone inside my cell.
So Terry, how did you get involved with writing Crimson Letters? How did that come about for you?
So some few years back, there was talk about implementing programs on death row. This was to ensure that those of us who did receive some relief from our death sentence did not emerge from death row stymied, by the years and the decades of idleness and the lapse in social development. So a pilot program was offered, and with its success, other programs followed, one of which was journalism, which is where I met Tessie Castillo in 2014. She was the instructor who had taught us the importance of recording our thoughts and chronicling our lives through stories. She encouraged us to stare onto the pages of our past and challenge our perspective. Then, due to some issues with publication and policy, Tessie was dismissed. But soon after, she contacted us by mail and offered to continue our work through correspondence. So we did. And after a while, myself and the co-authors of Crimson Letters had contributed enough material to compile into a book. Tessie helped with the critiques and the editing, and soon Crimson Letters was a real thing. So that's how I came to be involved in the book project.
And what do you hope to accomplish with the book and by being involved in it and putting your stories and your words out there?
I guess I hope to accomplish, what I hope to accomplish is to reawaken and reinforce the human connection that we all share through our stories as flawed yet ever aspiring people. The death penalty exists solely because there are some people who are deemed worthless when nothing could be further from the truth. We are all humans and prone to error, but beyond our mistakes, there is value. So death row inmates, we're not worthless, we're just flawed. And my hope is that Crimson Letters is a reminder of that.
Shortly after Crimson Letters was published, the prison banned that book and confiscated it from you guys. It took it away. Similar books such as The New Jim Crow and The Color Purple have also been confiscated in the past for being seen as posing a threat to the system. What was the reason, I guess, that the prison gave you for banning the book, and those books, all of the books, and what has been your reaction to the ban?
Okay. So it was said that there was a story in Crimson Letters that depicts a fake suicide attempt for the purpose of assaulting an officer, which is believed to promote institutional violence and harm to correctional staff. Except Crimson Letters does not promote violence. It's not some battle cry to rile prisoners to rise up against the system. In fact, Crimson Letters is our attempt to re-examine the mindset that causes violence, to better understand ourselves so that we are not bound to perpetuate our failures. And I guess my reaction to the banning of the book, I was disappointed. I think the decision violates a moral conduct. Crimson Letters is not a prison guide. It's a guide of humanity, one that all people, especially prisoners, should read.
Yeah, so I think I know which story you're talking about. And on someone on the outside, I didn't read that story and look at it as a call to arms for inmates. I saw it more as a cry of desperation than anything else. So given tensions now between the police and the public, all of the protests and things that are kind of going on the outside, how has that had an effect on your relationship with correctional officers?
I think the relationship between COs and inmates is a cordial one. No one understands the necessity for COs more than inmates. They have a job to do. And should they fail to perform those duties, they'll be dismissed and another CO will arrive to fulfill those very duties. So we expect them to do their job, but to also maintain a professional courtesy and mutual respect. And they do. So there aren't any gripes or change in the dynamic as a result of the tension in the streets.
So what ways do stereotypes about people of color and stereotypes about law enforcement, what role does that play in heightening tensions and contributing to conflicts?
I think race plays a tremendous role. I mean, racial bias is the foundation on which social inequality stands. And I remember the first time I heard the term white America, and I thought it meant white people. But now I realize that white America isn't about white people. It's about privileged people, like those for whom the laws protect versus those whom justice fails. When it comes to white people, they have stood alongside blacks since the civil rights movement, while white privilege kills blacks with impunity and workers' comp. I think Dr. Baumgartner did an excellent job in his book providing the statistics of racial imbalance in our judicial system. And we are, none of us, so naive to believe that that imbalance exists nowhere else.
So the next question I'm going to send to Dr. Baumgartner first. So I think you've been speaking to this all along, but what role does race play in the application of the death penalty?
Well, first, let me say shout out to Shanton, and it's really a privilege to get to hear from you directly because I've only heard about you from my wife, Jennifer. So it's nice to be with you, Shanton.
Yes, sir, you too.
Race plays a role in every aspect of criminal justice, and I think paradoxically more so than people realize, it's not even so much the race of the offender, but it's the race of the victim that matters. And crimes that have white victims are just much more harshly punished than crimes with black victims. And second, I should mention that jury selection is fundamental in all criminal justice proceedings. And we just had a ruling from the North Carolina Supreme Court about the Racial Justice Act, which, because of how it was written, allows people to contest their death sentence if either of three things happen. The race of the perpetrator was a factor, the race of the victim was a factor, or there was racial bias in the selection of the jury. And that last element, racial bias in the selection of the jury, that is going to cause everybody to win their case, because bleaching the jury, eliminating blacks from the jury, is a standard practice in American trials, and it has always been. Black Americans, for reasons that are obvious, don't have the same level of trust in police and prosecutors as white Americans do on average. And so prosecutors seeking to get a conviction would rather have a white jury than a black jury, no matter who the defendant is, but especially when it's a black defendant. Anyway, race is just everywhere in criminal justice.
There we go. I have to unmute myself. Terry, for you,
You have 60 seconds remaining.
All right, I'm going to hold that question, and I'm going to ask Terry when he comes back because I know he's getting ready to be cut off. Obviously, we're all aware of all of the protests that have been going on. Dr. Baumgartner, what's your hope for coming out of all of these protests? What would reform look like?
Well, my hope is that of all the reforms that get enacted, because I do believe many reforms will be enacted, that several of them will stick and have a big impact. And so I'm just not sure which particular reforms will be enacted. But I could propose one right now, amend the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment says that the condition of slavery and indentured servitude is abolished, except for those duly convicted of a crime. And if we could amend it simply to delete that clause, except for those duly convicted of a crime, we would eliminate so much injustice inside prisons. Prisoners are required to work. If they don't work, they get put in solitary confinement. And when they work, they get paid something like 75 cents a day, depending on what their job is. So Shanton can probably talk about that. Death row inmates don't work, but other inmates do. And it's slavery.
Yeah, that was eye-opening for me, again, just to mention the documentary again, 13th, to actually see that written out. I think so many people, we need a huge refresher in civics, starting with the Constitution and the amendments, just to see what's actually written there. That was absolutely eye-opening.
All you have to do is read the Constitution. It's been
Yep.
there since 1865.
Yeah, absolutely. But how many of us haven't had, taken a look at it since, high school civics class? And even then, I don't recall digging that deep into it and actually reading the Constitution. It certainly didn't stick if I did.
North Carolina runs a farm on one of the prison camps. And Louisiana and Mississippi operate real plantations where they grow cotton, and they have black prisoners with white guards on horseback, forcing them to pick cotton. That's still happening today.
It's unbelievable. Tessie, is Terry back in? Terry, are you with us? He's here. Okay, thank you so much. So I'm gonna jump back up to the question I was gonna ask you before you got cut off. So before you left, Dr. Baumgartner was speaking to the application of race in the death penalty. I wanted to ask you, how do racial tensions play out within prison? And this can be both, you kind of spoke to the relationship you have with the correctional officers. So that a little bit, and then also racial tensions among inmates.
Well, in my previous experience with prison, there is a natural order of social grouping in prison. And whites just kind of typically stick with whites, and blacks kind of typically stick with blacks. That's just the prison dynamic. Then you have the other factors to add in, like home sets. People may be from Charlotte versus some people from this region. So those things play a factor in the racial dynamic inside the prison. But unfortunately, death row is a different dynamic because we don't have a process where we have an intake and an outtake system. So there are no flood of new guys coming in or new faces. And we have done time with each other for 15 years, and in some cases more, 20, 25, and so. And it constitutes this natural cordialness for one another. So there isn't so much as a racial imbalance here in the social dynamic of death row. It's kind of just everyone having this shared adversity and then kind of being empathetic with one another.
So I just want to remind our audience, if you have questions, you can start sending those to me in the chat. Me being Greensboro Bound, that should be the name that pops up there in the chat. Make sure you send them to Greensboro Bound. So Terry, the next question is also for you. So justifiably, the public has been outraged over the deaths of Ahmaud Aubrey, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and the countless others. And many people have called for the death penalty for those responsible. As someone who is currently on death row, do you believe that the death sentence is an appropriate punishment for those crimes?
I do not. No. I think the death penalty is immoral, and it is an inappropriate sentence under any circumstances. Because, again, as I said before, we are human. We are prone to error. And our errors do not diminish our rights to live, even when those errors at times may result in the loss of life. And I think that because we are a vengeful nation and quick to undermine people's values, I mean, it is a result of ourselves placating our own tendency for cruelty. But when you have lived death row and you have experienced it, and you know the psychological ramifications of witnessing executions, that is a cruelty that no person should endure. So I believe that yes, there is accountability to be had for officers who kill unarmed civilians, but executing them is never the answer.
Yeah. I have a personal question, and I apologize. Do you prefer to be called Terry or Chanton? And I apologize for not asking you that before.
Sure. It's okay. Either one is fine. Most of my friends and close loved ones, call me Chanton.
Okay. All right. Just wanted to clarify, and I apologize for not asking. So in one of your essays, you speak about how death row is not a place that lacks humanity. You say it is where humanity is rediscovered and restored. On death row, the meaningfulness of life tremendously exceeds the inevitability of death. What do you mean by that?
So at the time when I wrote that quote or that portion of the book, I guess I was speaking in reference to the transformation that takes place in one's perspective when you wake up every day and you are faced with the likelihood or the probability of your death. Because I guess I see life as, in my opinion, life is like this cycle of distractions from the inevitability of death. At least that was the way for me. I never thought about death. And I went through life and I indulged in all of this misconduct, and I drank and I smoked and I did everything to kind of deflect the idea that with each passing moment, I am growing closer to my death. But here on death row, when all those distractions are removed and all you have is the likelihood that you will die, then life takes on a more purposeful meaning. Like even the little things, all the subtleties in life that once were ignored, they just have this profound meaning. And you pay attention to everything. And you just become desperately aware of like every waking second. So at the time I was trying to kind of express what it's like to have that that future of possibly being executed on your plate, and the appreciation that it restores, the humanity that it restores, because it does kind of emote into this social dynamic where men on death row are desperate to be better than who they were, so that if we are unfortunate enough to not make it out of here, if we are unfortunate enough to be executed, then we have a say in the person that they execute. And it doesn't have to be who the world says is executed. It doesn't have to be a worthless man or a man who is unremorseful. And I can be remorseful, and I can have motivation, and I can push for something better. So at the time I was trying to really express like the desperation that the having a death sentence causes and what it does to the transformation of one's perspective.
Thank you for sharing that, your thoughts behind those sentences. So switching gears just a little bit, this is actually one of our audience questions, and it was the next question I was going to ask anyway. But what is it like for you watching current events, the murders, the protests, everything that's going on? What is it like to watch that from death row? What are your feelings about it? And then what do you hope the outcomes will be from the protest when we're hopefully a little closer to the other side of this? What do you hope has changed?
I think we definitely need more regulations in the authoritative rights of police officers, and especially when we see like civilians who are being stopped doing routine traffic stops, and then they are being dragged from their vehicles and tased. So for me, when I see the events on TV, I think it has been in light of the protests and the backlash, it has been a long time coming, because we can suspect that this kind of behavior and misconduct has been going on for decades, and it has not been challenged. My personal opinion in the prison reform, I think that there are both sides that need reform. When you have two opposing elements like police brutality and then the people that rise up against brutality, then we have to recognize that how we contribute. And there is a way in which we stereotype police that creates a psychological hostility towards certain people of profile, certain people of background. And when they encounter these people, they are biased by nature. So I look at my own experiences, how I would see a cop, if he was in uniform, he was a pig, or he was a rat, or he was this, or he was that, and I would place all these stigmas onto a person for just wanting to help the community do their job. And I also could see how my bias could easily equate to the psychological shaping of the police officer himself. So I think that there are two sides that need to be fixed. Sure, we need police reform, but we also need civil reform. And I think that, as a side note, police have it hard. And not to justify any actions, of course, just I can imagine. I have people that I know personally who are in law enforcement, and it's a raw deal, you know.
So I had asked you earlier if the death penalty was an appropriate punishment for law officers or vigilantes who kill unarmed civilians, and you had an emphatic no, it would not be appropriate. What do you think would be an appropriate punishment?
I mean, I have known people who were in prison for a life sentence. And I think in many cases, because the reality is that some of us are not psychologically fit to live in society. And in that case, there needs to be an institution that will tend to us. Sometimes it may be an asylum. Sometimes it may be prison. But a life spent in prison is more than sufficient punishment. So I just do not think that the death penalty in no circumstance constitutes an appropriate punishment. And I think that we as an advanced nation, when we continue to support sanction executions, that it's an example or a sign that we as a people are regressing.
So I have a feeling that your time is about to be up, but I'm going to go ahead and ask you this next question. This is from one of our audience members. So is there a way that those of us on the outside can support you in a sincere and sensitive way? What, if anything, can we do for you?
For the advocacy and the cause against death penalty, or me personally?
I think you personally, you as a person, as a human being, what can we, is there anything that we can do to help you? And then you can broaden that to advocacy as well.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
Yeah, that was coming.
So should I call back? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead and call back. Yep, we'll pick that up.
All right.
So Dr. Baumgartner, I'm going to take it to you and ask the same series of questions while Tessie gets him back on the line. Same question. And I've already asked you what you hope the outcome of the protest would be. Second part of that would be a appropriate consequence or appropriate punishment for law officers who kill unarmed civilians.
Well, I think it should be the same. I mean, I think it should be the same as when a civilian kills somebody, if it's a homicide. And so, but it's also, important to think through what are the practical realities of how police officers work hand in glove with district attorneys' offices. And one thing that I think should be automatic, but which is not, when a police officer is under investigation of criminal charges, those criminal charges shouldn't be handled by the local district attorney. Because that local district attorney works all the time with that police department to investigate and to develop prosecutions of other criminals. And so there's a conflict of interest that's inherent in the idea that you're going to work day in and day out with a whole staff of people in a given police department. And then at the same time, your office is going to also be prosecuting and potentially putting into prison for many years one of their members. So I think there's a conflict of interest there that really subverts justice, and we should find ways to get around it. And a simple way would be to have a prosecutor from a different district prosecute police officers.
Okay. All right. I think we're almost going to have him back.
But I don't want to suggest that that's the only reform. I'm just trying to be specific. And I think there's any number of reforms that we need. It's obvious that the system is broken. And I hope that people will recognize that, you know, protesters aren't making stuff up. This stuff is real. The disparities are real, and prosecutors and district attorneys and police leaders need to think long and hard about, can you police if the community doesn't trust the police? And what have we done to break that trust? And can we change it?
Shanton?
Yeah,
hey, there you go. Hey, yes, I can. Thank you. So I'm going to go back to that question I asked you. Yep. So I'm gonna ask it a little bit different way. So as far as supporting you in a meaningful way, I know you kind of alluded to the fact that you spend a lot of time in your cell alone, or reading or writing. So in supporting you that way, you know, would it be supportive of you to hear from more people on the outside, to have correspondence for more folks, other ways that we can support you personally, and then, you know, your ways of your ideas on advocacy as well. So kind of two parts of that question.
All right. Yeah, so I think personally, I mean, I love the support that we have been receiving for the book project, Crimson Letters. And so that is certainly a way that helps myself and not just the co-authors of Crimson Letters, but all death row inmates. There are reading materials, especially in law, that we can always use. We don't have a law library here. And so that kind of can be really frustrating when you have the capability to help yourself, but not the means. I've always been, I don't necessarily think that it's a great characteristic. I see it as a flaw, but I've always had issues with asking for help. Mm-hmm. And so over the years, I don't reach out to ask for money for books or money for commissary or for things, but those things are a necessity here on death row. So I think that any material that people could send in, doesn't have to be an entire book, just things, you know, information off the internet that could kind of help in, because I know the means by which I can help myself, but I just don't have the how-to. And so in that way, that could certainly be extreme help to me. And also, I've always believed that my case needed exposure, as much exposure possible, because I have nothing, none of the elements of my case to hide behind. My case, unfortunately, has kind of been under wraps, and it makes it more difficult when there aren't people. I don't need people to fight for me or support me. I need them to ask questions. I need them to take a really hard look at my case and just ask questions, the logical ones. As far as advocacy, I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but in the last week there has been some people here who have kind of congregated outside of our prison in response to the protests. We've kind of felt the effects of that inside the prison. We usually are out at around 8 o'clock watching TV, but these few nights we had to go inside of our cell and lock down. I don't know if there was a security threat because they was outside gathering or what. I saw it as inspiration. The only time we would see people gathering outside the prison was during execution nights. Mm-hmm. They would have vigils for these people that's being executed. So to see people in the midst of a civil protest on police brutality, to take the time out and support the advocacy against the death penalty, it was very enlightening, very inspiring, and I thought we need more of that.
Mm-hmm. So Tessie, I have a quick question for you, because I know that you've been, you have been corresponding and you've been inside the prisons. Is the public allowed to send books and materials? Are there special guidelines for those stuff? I'm sure they could, if there is, they're on a website, but what are the rules, the general rules about stuff like that?
Yeah, you can send in books and other items. It's actually pretty easy to do. You can find the whole roster for people on death row just by Googling it. I think you just put North Carolina death row, and you'll see all the names and all the addresses. There are obviously guidelines within the prison. Certain books are allowed, certain books are not allowed. Don't try to send them our book. So those kind of things. But in general, if it's not a banned item, yes, you can send it into the prison. And if it is a banned item, they'll just send it back to you.
Okay. Okay. All right. Shannon, I'll come back to you. So I guess you've spoken to this a little bit kind of in some of your other responses about kind of finding purpose in your life. You have all of this time to kind of assess and evaluate. But what does give you purpose from day to day?
I mean, it's a very simple answer. Really kind of expected, but my family. Like, I have the most wonderful mom, and I saw the commitment and the sacrifices that she made for her children coming up, and it's where my measure of morals come from, my ethic. Everything I learned was from her. And I also have children, as I spoke before, 3 children and 4 grandchildren, and I always wanted to not give them more than my mom gave me, but an equal amount, because there was no greater love than the love she gave her children. And I just wanted to do the same for them. So, again, when you are faced with this idea that you may be kind of sitting in the mess of the end of your life, you want to do what you can for the people that you love. And so I write for myself as therapy, but I also write for my family, because I want them to know who I am, and I want to be like unapologetic. I want to be upfront. You know, I think my children, my mom, and my brothers and my sister, anyone who knows and loves me deserves to know who I was, flaws and all. And that's what gives me purpose.
I was really struck by your essays. They were so focused on your family, and that definitely came through your love and your relationship that you have with your family. Particularly, I was just looking back through, you know, the way that your Aunt Patsy has supported you, and then the essay or the story you tell about your Aunt Puddin. You know, that was really striking how you've been able to maintain your relationship with your family members, because I know that a lot of times inmates, not only ones on death row, but your family just kind of falls away and you no longer have contact and you're completely isolated, and how you and your family have just been able to kind of maintain a relationship. So if you could give any advice to your younger self, what would you tell him back in the day? What would you say to him?
It's okay to say no. Don't be afraid. I'm just so moved by people who have their own mind, their own personality, and dare to be different, because it wasn't something that I was brave enough to do. And I saw, I mean, not to put my faults and my errors to pass blame, because I accept full culpability for the things that I've done, but I also know how I was kind of shaped. I was tempered. I was engaging in the things that my peers were engaging in, and I thought that I kind of had to, in order to be the same. I didn't want to be different. I wanted to be accepted. So I did a lot of terrible things, and it all stemmed from my inability to say no. So if I could go back, I would certainly tell my younger self that it's okay to be different and say no.
Yeah. I just want to let our audience know we only have a few more minutes here with Chanton. So if you have any other questions that you would like to ask specifically of him, if you'll go ahead and send those to me in the chat box so we can make sure we have time with him. But while we're waiting for those to come through, I do have one last question for you. For all the folks who are listening in today, if you could give them one action item, one thing you would want for them to do when they get off of this this call and away from this event, what something that would educate them about the death penalty, what would you want that thing to be?
I would say vote. Please vote. And I can't emphasize that enough. I think there's just so many people out there who still don't understand the magnitude of voting. I mean, I certainly didn't. I myself have never voted. But ironically, it's the thing that I long to do most. Like right now in this moment, with all this going on, I wish that I could vote. So I would strongly encourage people to vote. I mean, I would also say to the protesters to hold the line. Just hold the line and stay the course. Because I think change, like I think we're on the cusp of something phenomenal. This era is coming up, and the time before us was extreme for our country. But I also know that we protested before in the past, and this is not something that's new. But I think this time what's different is that people are showing resilience, and they just hold the line. So that would be my advice to the protesters: just hold the line and stay the course. I think that change is not come with the loudest voice, but it's one with resilience.
Yeah. So just to kind of wrap up, is there, I mean, we've asked you a lot of questions covering a range of things here. Is there anything else that you want us to know about you specifically that you feel it gets lost in communication?
Excuse me, is there anything else that I want to know about myself?
Yeah, like that you'd like to share with us, something that you want people to know about you.
It's kind of funny, but I've recently discovered that I'm a nerd. I love fantasy books. I love role-playing games. And I love the social closeness and proximity that it invokes. So I didn't think that it was cool when I was younger. Chess and band and all the things that were exciting to me, I kind of deviated because of they were unacceptable in the social grouping that I was attending. But now I'm proud to say that I love role-playing games. I love fantasy and sci-fi. So I'm proud to be a nerd.
I love it. My husband is a nerd too. He used to play D&D more, so I have a soft spot for nerds. So that's pretty awesome. We did have one question from an audience member. So do the other inmates, those who did not participate either in Crimson Letters?
You have 60 seconds remaining.
4 of you.
So I only have to.
I know I'm going to have to let this question go, but I do want to thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate you spending time. And if I'm going to unmute everybody, so if you want to make some noise, give them some claps, let them know that you're here.
Thank you, Chanton.
Thank you so much.
Yes. You too, Dr. Baumgartner.
Thank you, Chanton.
Thank you.
You have 30 seconds remaining.
All right.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys' support.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us. I wish you the best. Thank you. Take care.
I will.
Okay. So we've got a few more minutes we're going to spend here with just Tessie and Dr. Baumgartner kind of following up. So because we got cut off with him, do you, Tessie, or Dr. V, did you want to come back to any of these questions specifically? I feel like we all have the same. We all want the same outcomes from the protest, obviously change and reform. But is there anything else that you would like to add, Tessie, before we get back into the questions just for you two?
Yeah, in regards to the one thing that you can do, Chanton, saying voting, I think it's really important to focus specifically on voting for district attorneys and judges. Those are races that most people don't even think about at all. A lot of people don't even know what a district attorney is. And yet the district attorney in your county, which is the lead prosecutor in your county, they shape the entire culture in that county. And they can choose just based on personal preferences whether to pursue the death penalty or not. I mean, we have counties here in North Carolina where the district attorney will never pursue the death penalty. And we have counties, there's one in particular that I know of, where the district attorney pursues the death penalty in every single first-degree murder case, all of them. So just it's hard to understate how much power a district attorney has. They can do almost anything. They can they can charge somebody, they can not charge somebody, they can charge them with lots of things, they can charge them with few things. They wield enormous amounts of power. And so who holds that seat and who's in power and what their values are unbelievably important. So when you're voting, pay attention to who's running for district attorney and what their values are, and make sure that you get somebody in office that reflects the value that you want.
Let me add to that, sheriffs. Sheriffs and district attorneys are both elected at the county level, and they have a huge impact. The sheriffs run the jails, and the district attorney, as Tessie says, makes all the charging decisions. And these are usually low visibility elections, low turnout elections, and low cost elections. So contributing a little bit of money is going to be lost in a United States Senate campaign, which is going to be in the tens of millions of dollars. But for sheriff or for district attorney, it's going to be low dollars, low visibility, and low turnout. So you can have an impact on those elections.
All right, so in the last couple of weeks, we've actually seen accountability in action. The father and son responsible for Ahmaud Aubrey's death have been arrested and charged. Officer Chauvin, who was charged with with George Floyd's death. Some police departments with problematic histories are losing their funding. Do you feel hopeful that things will change as we're forcing them to be more accountable for their actions? Are you hopeful that that will happen?
What was that question to?
That was actually for both of you, so whoever wants to take it first.
I'll go first. I'm hopeful. I mean, we've already seen a lot of things happen. Just even the fact that there are some cities that are looking at their police departments and how much funding they're allocating to what is hopeful to me. I think it's really important that we understand that the entire system is fundamentally broken. And so to do these sort of piecemeal things, piecemeal reforms to criminal justice, which is what we've been doing for many decades now, is not really going to cut it. We really need something sweeping. When I describe the criminal justice system to people, sometimes I describe it as, it's a lot like the medical system, where you've got, people who are just sort of shuffled into the doctor's office. We only get 5 minutes alone with a doctor, and usually we're given a pill for something and then just sort of sent home. And the underlying problem, the underlying condition that caused us to get sick is usually not addressed. But it's just, that's the way the system's set up. It's just like, get as many people in as possible. Don't get to the root of the problem. Just give them something quick and send them home. And the criminal justice system is a lot like that too. It's completely overwhelmed. I mean, it's just sagging under the weight of the number of cases that are in it. And because of that, the district attorneys and prosecutors who are moving these cases through, they're doing them at lightning speed and they're doing a really sloppy job because there's just so many, and they're slapping these sentences or punishments on that don't address the root cause of the behavior at all. They're just slapping on the punishments and then move on to the next one, and then slap on a punishment and move on to the next one, get people through the system. And then, as we know, they get out eventually and then they go back into the system again. in the majority of cases, because when they get out on the outside after serving time in jail or prison, they're no better off than they were before, and they have even fewer social supports, fewer opportunities at employment, fewer opportunities for housing. So it's just a system that feeds itself and that doesn't address any of the root causes of crime. So we need a system that does address those things and that values actual public safety. Because the system now, it says it values public safety, but how can it if it doesn't stop crimes and if people just keep committing them over and over and over again? So that's what I would say. The change needs to be big.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think we'd even find consensus with police leaders if we could say that the police have been asked to fix things that they don't have the tools to fix. You know, they have handcuffs, guns, tasers, and jail time. And sometimes what they need is psychological counseling, or they need to offer somebody a job or a place to stay or some food. And the police don't have those tools. And so if you don't have the appropriate tools, you can't fix the problem. And we've gutted so many of our social programs, and our educational system is so unequal. The economy is so unequal, and we live in separate parts of town. Our segregation levels are as high as they were in the 1950s, I think. And so we have so many social issues, and we've relied on the police to solve them by using the tools that they have, which are inappropriate. So I certainly hope that we will see some really far-reaching reforms, but I think there will be pushback because it'll be expensive. Police is cheap compared to equality. And we need to keep pushing until we solve the root causes, like Tessie says.
So one of our audience members had asked if there are resources for staying up to date on things like district attorney elections. I would recommend the League of Women Voters as a place to start. That's lwvleaguewomenvoter.org. It's just a great place to stay abreast of elections. You can find your own representatives. You can look up other elections, voting rights. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. So do you two have any other specific resources that you could recommend just to kind of help people stay abreast of things in elections?
North Carolina Board of Elections sends out information on elections, and they usually have questionnaires that they send out to all the candidates, so you can see what their answers are. I use that a lot when I'm voting.
Yeah, and I believe that the League of Women Voters provides information like that as well. So yes, the voter guide does come out in the mail typically, and then the Board of Elections website. So that'd be a great place to start. So let me come back here. So Dr. Baumgartner, one of our audience members asks, she says she actually just sent a letter to Governor Cooper this week, an actual typed up letter. What is your opinion on whether or not you think he has any interest in actually abolishing the death penalty, especially since he has obviously started a task force since all the protests, and he said data shows that nationwide communities of color are disproportionately affected in all stages of the criminal justice system. My words are, he says that, but do you think he has an appetite to actually take it all the way?
Well, I really can't speak for the governor. I can say that he hasn't abolished the death penalty, and he hasn't announced any plans to do so. I do think that the North Carolina death penalty is simply withering away on the vine, and that people in the system can see that the Racial Justice Act litigation is most likely a fatal blow to the death penalty. It will kill the death penalty, because if you can't cook the jury selection process, you can't have the death penalty system that people have had in the past. And the Racial Justice Act says you can't do that. And so that will contaminate, it will be shown statistically to have contaminated virtually every jury selection of all those on death row. And so it will clog up the courts until the courts decide that they don't want to hear those cases anymore, and they'll give some kind of blanket class action relief. Now I say relief, but relief only accounts to removing someone from death row and putting them into general population where they have a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. So that's another form of a death sentence. They won't leave the prison alive. And that's the relief that's considered under the Racial Justice Act. But in any case, I think the death penalty in North Carolina is done. We won't execute anybody. And then the question is, at what point will our leaders come to the position where they recognize that and make de jure what already is de facto? And I think most likely, given what I see, I think they'll wait for the Supreme Court to do that for them, so that I don't see them taking a firm, strong stand. And I don't want to blame the current governor, because he's one in a series who's refused to take a strong stand against the death penalty. And I hope that he will. But, and I think he has the opportunity now, because of this recent ruling by the North Carolina Supreme Court, that pretty much when you play it out, it means that death sentences the executions will never resume. And most likely, the vast majority of individuals on death row who have a right to a hearing will find that their hearings are successful, because the jury selection process was so blatantly manipulated through racial bias and what we call jury bleaching. That is, making the jury whiter than it would be otherwise.
So I have a question kind of to follow up on that, where abolishing the death penalty is one thing, but there are also all of these cases where people are behind bars with life and no possibility of parole, which, as you just said, is in essence a death sentence. They'll never have any, redemption or a chance to go back out into society. So I guess I'm trying to formulate the question as I'm asking it, so forgive me, but what is your stance on that, basically, for locking people up for the rest of their lives with no possibility of parole? Are there some people that you believe would qualify into that, the worst of the worst? They should never have an opportunity for parole. And then kind of the application of those sentences of people who, I'm assuming also an unfair application of no chance for parole as well.
We have an epidemic of life without parole sentences in our country, throughout the country. And it's a policy that was adopted in the mid-'80s to mid-'90s. It previously didn't exist in our criminal justice system. There was no such thing as life with no possibility of parole. It doesn't exist in most countries. And since it was adopted, say, 25 years ago, and most people who go into prison, like Shanton, I think, was in his early 20s when he went into prison. Most people who commit violent crimes are in their 20s. So that was 25 years ago. So now those people are in their 40s and 50s. Well, 10 years from now, they're going to be in their 60s. And if they survive 10 years after that, they're going to be in their 70s. And we're going to be the first nation in the history of the world to have tens of thousands of individuals imprisoned who are septuagenarians. We're going to have to take out mortgages to buy bedpans. We're going to have such an enormous number of geriatric prisoners like the world has never seen. And this is an obvious consequence of the reforms that took place in the tough on crime period in the 80s and 90s. And I think it's a human rights catastrophe that's getting ready to happen. It's just starting. We already have a large number of people in North Carolina over the age of 65 still in prison serving a life sentence. And that's unprecedented, but we ain't seen nothing yet. We're going to have more and more because we adopted these policies about 25 years ago. And so if we don't change them and come up with some kind of system to review what's the threat to public safety of a 68-year-old man who's in a wheelchair? He's not the same as that 23-year-old man who was violent and angry and drug addicted back, 50 years ago when he came into prison. And so when we balance the threat to public safety with the need for punishment, I think we can see that, you know, a certain number of years of punishment or a certain number of decades of punishment might be sufficient for retribution purposes. But when we think about public safety, we're not being made any safer by having 85-year-old individuals still incarcerated as they wait to die. So I think that is, that's another topic. That's not the death penalty as we think about it, but it's a human rights catastrophe, and America will lead the world in that particular aspect of it.
Right. Yeah.
There's another issue with life without parole that differentiates it from the death penalty, and it's one that a lot of people don't know about, but it's really important. If you get a death sentence, you have the right to a lawyer, and the lawyers appeal the sentence, but 2 lawyers. But if you get life without parole, you don't. You're just done. There's no right to appeals after that. If you have money, you can hire a lawyer, but almost none of them have that. So anyone who has their sentence commuted to life without parole, or who's given life without parole originally, they don't have the right to lawyers to help appeal their sentences. So all of those cases that have these egregious errors where prosecutors withheld evidence or paid informants to testify, all these things, they just don't get uncovered with life without parole cases because there's no one there to represent them after the initial trial. And that's something I wonder about, especially for people like Shantan. He did go into prison before the 2001 reforms that Dr. Baumgartner talked about. And his case, if you look at it, was horrible. His lawyers didn't defend him at all. I mean, literally during the trial, after the prosecutor laid out his case, the lawyers just said the defense rests. They never tried to defend him. His case was based on no physical evidence at all that he had committed the crime, just on the testimony of 2 people who had participated. And one of those people got only 12 years instead of a death sentence. And the other one was paid $5,000 and not charged at all in exchange for his testimony against Shantan. So those kind of things are really important, but he could lose his right to counsel. Not that his lawyers are doing much anyways right now. But that's something to think about when you think about life without parole. It's not like, oh, that's great. Now there's no death penalty anymore. There's downsides to that too.
The death penalty is a strange paradox because the Supreme Court has ruled that, you know, death is different than any other type of punishment, and therefore there have to be safeguards for people who have a death sentence. So they have the automatic right to appeal their sentence through to the federal system. Whereas if you have any sentence less than death, you don't have that automatic right. And also they've ruled that such inmates are required to be provided capital appeals attorneys just for the appellate part after they've been convicted. And that's not the case otherwise. So those are really important changes. And to the extent that people are worried about executing innocent people, the solution to that is to make sure that there's procedural safeguards. And then the result of that is that there's these capital appeals attorneys, and 70% of the time they're successful. And so if we think about life without parole as an alternative, then, you know, there could be many, many people, not just a few, but potentially a majority who would not have the opportunity to have those appeals. And the death row inmates, you know, their experience shows that most of these appeals are successful. Now, I should say that the 70% success rate does not mean that their conviction was overturned. Oftentimes it's just their death sentence was overturned as excessive. But sometimes it's the conviction itself and they get a new trial. And then sometimes they're acquitted at the second trial, or they're fully exonerated from the crime. Now, but that number doesn't rise up to the number of, you know, the level of 70%. That's more like 5%.
And the ability to have the 2 lawyers represent you once you're on death row, that is federal, or is that across the board, everyone?
Yeah, it's a federal requirement for everybody across the country. Okay. And then in no way does it apply to people that have a lesser sentence, but life without parole is is a death sentence with a different name.
So just to remind anyone, if you have any questions, to please send them in the chat, and I will be glad to ask Tessie and Dr. Baumgartner. So one kind of final thing to ask you both. A lot of us, myself included, we get our ideas about the criminal justice system from TV or news. I personally am a huge Law and Order fan. I've watched all of them. However, I realize that it is fiction, but I know a lot of people, we kind of get that notion just like we do with like investigative police dramas. We think there's all this technology, and really that's not how it works at all. So with all those things in mind, what are some things that you really wish, let's say top 3 things from each of you, and they can be the same or not. And if you've got more, tell us more, but what are the top 3 things that you wish that we knew about the criminal justice system and how it operates, and kind of how movies and TV have skewed our understanding of how things actually go down?
You want to start?
Well, I'll start with one. Maybe we can go back and forth. The first one is, I wish that they wouldn't give people the idea that you actually get your day in court.
Mm.
Over 90% of people don't ever get to court. They're forced into plea agreements. And I wish that there would be a better understanding of the likelihood that if you're poor, you'll never leave jail after the day you get arrested. You can't make bail. And so our cash bail system is just a disgrace. And if you're poor and guilty, poor and innocent, you're going to come off worse than if you're rich and guilty, as Brian Stevenson has said. So I wish that people would understand that the system is going to be overloaded with a huge caseload. Your lawyer isn't going to have much time to talk to you. The judge won't know anything about the case. And the prosecutor and the public defender are most likely going to work out a deal in about 20 seconds to process your case. And that's what they'll talk about. We need to process this case. And will you accept this plea deal? And the public defender is most likely to say, yeah, that's how we're doing it this week. And that's your day in court. You'll never see the judge. So I wish we would have a little more reality about how the system really works for the thousands and thousands of people who go through for relatively medium to low level crimes. And when you have that on your record, it is hard to go through life. Even if you just spend a short time in prison, that's something that will affect you for the rest of your life and dramatically increase the chances that you'll come back. And it's not necessarily because you're a hardened criminal and you're just a criminal by nature. It's because that's going to stop you from getting a house, being able to rent an apartment. Your girlfriend's going to leave you. Your employer's going to not want to have you back. And all kinds of things are going to follow you with a felony conviction, even if the felony led to an 18-month sentence the first time. It'll probably lead to a second one. And then after a while, 3 strikes, you're out. In North Carolina, you're a habitual felon. And then you have a life sentence. So, yeah, I wish there was a little more reality in people's understanding of how broken and overwhelmed with numbers the system is and how it's targeted on poor people. And rich and middle class people just don't have any experience with it. Thank goodness, for people like us. But if you're in the system, it's not like in the movies.
Yeah. Tessie?
I would like for people to know, so that was one, how most people never go to court. Another thing that I see a lot of is how, so police and sheriff's offices and prosecutors are under a lot of pressure to solve crimes, especially really serious ones like murder that are very high profile. They're under a lot of pressure to find somebody and bring them to justice. And it's very frequent that they will take the testimony of one person against another and give that person a reduced sentence, or even pay them sometimes to testify against another person, and then base an entire trial and an entire conviction on the testimony of someone who was incentivized to testify that way. Or how people know that. They know that if I committed a really serious crime and I'm going to get in trouble and they're almost definitely going to find me, if I go to the police and I plead guilty right away and I tell them that I'm going to show them all the other people involved and I'm going to tell them how all the other people were involved in the crime, then they're going to give me a much lower sentence. And so people do that. And you can get innocent people caught up in webs like that. You can get people who were the mastermind potentially of a crime getting a much lower sentence than someone who was just a getaway driver because they weren't the first one to confess, or they weren't willing to throw their friends under the bus. So there's just a lot of convictions that happen like that are sort of based on testimonies from people who received enormous incentives, and it often is financial, in order to testify in court against their friends or against other people. So that's really important. I mean, there's so many things. I wish people knew how laws were made. I was a lobbyist prior to writing this book. I worked for a small nonprofit, and we did overdose prevention kind of work, drug policy kind of work. And so I was in the North Carolina legislature for years, and I got to see how the laws are made. And I could spend hours talking about the nonsense that goes on in that building. But one thing I'll say that relates to this is that every time something happens and the legislators are under pressure to do something and to act, they often create a new crime, and that's sort of their way to solve it. They'll think, oh, we're dealing with a crisis now where a lot of people are dying of overdoses, so let's make it a new crime to give someone a pill, or they create new crimes all the time instead of addressing the underlying issue, because it's so much easier to just make a new crime up, and they don't really think about the consequences. And unlike most things, like, for example, if you want to deal with drugs or with an overdose crisis, obviously providing adequate treatment to people who are struggling with addiction would be a way to address that issue. But if the legislature wants to provide more treatment, they have to get money to do that. And since there's only a limited amount of money in the budget, they have to take the money from a different program, like from, I don't know, education or something, and funnel it into providing more addiction treatment. And so that would create a huge squabble. So they don't want to do that. So instead of actually funding the problem, they'll create a new crime. And they don't have to fund the bill that says, oh, we're going to make a new crime. Even though obviously creating a new crime and arresting more people or lengthening the sentences of people who are already arrested does cost money to taxpayers, but they don't have to put that into the budget if it's a new crime issue. But if it was like more funding for education or more funding for treatment, they would have to put it in the budget. So it's like this weird, it's almost like there's unlimited money for criminal justice, but not for other things. So that's something I wish people knew too.
So I have another question here from an audience member, and I'll direct this to Dr. Baumgartner first, and then Tessie, if you want to also contribute. So since most of the decisions are made at county and state levels, everything's very fragmented and decentralized. It seems that even federal level reforms won't be of much help. If you know, given that being the case, what gives you hope that the reforms being considered will actually make a noticeable difference both in the short and in the long term?
Well, there's two kinds of reforms, and I think that most of the reforms that will have the biggest impact will be enacted by city governments. There'll be municipal reforms that change the nature of their municipal police force. And they'll change the budget, they'll change the policies, and it'll be based on a local decision. And, you know, there's 18,000 police forces in our country, and hopefully the vast majority of them will undergo some type of reform. But like in so many areas of American politics, it'll be piecemeal. It'll be done here, but not there. And there'll be pockets where significant reforms will be enacted, and there'll be places where no reforms at all are enacted. So that's the nature of our disjointed federalism. So I think it's an opportunity and a curse at the same time for reformers, because you can reform a city without reforming the entire state. And you can reform one state without reforming the entire country. So on the one hand, it's an opportunity to enact some serious reforms at the local level. And on the other hand, it's a frustrating characteristic of our system that one reform won't apply nationwide. The reforms that would apply nationwide would be constitutional reforms and legal action to create new constitutional interpretations. And there, I think the reasonable police officer standard is ripe for litigation. What are the conditions under which we can find a police officer guilty of a crime? Under the current jurisprudence, it's very, very difficult to find a police officer guilty of a lapse in judgment when he shoots somebody and then he says that I was under fear for my life. The controlling standard by the US Supreme Court is that a reasonable police officer has to have made that same decision. But, we just saw that case in Atlanta where the citizen, Ray Sean, I can't remember his last name, but the citizen in Atlanta had a taser and the police officer shot him in the back as he ran away. And the police officer, presumably in the past, would simply argue, well, he had a weapon and I feared for my life. But he was running in the other direction. So there was clearly no immediate threat to the officer's life whatsoever. And so now the question is, what's the legal precedent that would drive or determine the ruling of whether that person is guilty of a crime or not, that police officer? So I think those legal interpretations of Supreme Court doctrine are what's going to control things at the national level. And then at the same time, we have to work with our city councils and mayors and police chiefs to change policies on the ground.
Yeah. All right. So we're almost out of time. So I just want to first thank both of you for coming today and being part of this. Again, just to remind everyone, this is our second in a series of 4. We'll be speaking next Thursday with another one of Tessie's co-authors. And I believe it's Dr. Robert Brown is next week. He'll be with us. So Dr. Baumgartner, is there anything that you've got going on, whether you're speaking publicly or anything that you would like for our audience to know about?
Not in particular. I mostly spend my time writing books and articles, so I'm busy doing that. I don't have any public events that people need to know about, but I'm glad to have been here, and thanks to Tessie for writing this important book.
All right. And you, Tessie. So first off, I'm just going to hold up her book again, wait for it to come into focus. So again, Crimson Letters, Voices from Death Row. If you're here in Greensboro, you can check it out. Well, excuse me, not check it out. You can purchase it from Scuppernong Books or your local independent bookstore, whatever city you may be in. Tessie, aside from spending a couple more days with us, what else have you got going on?
Sure. So we've started a book club for Crimson Letters, which is an opportunity for people to dive a little bit deeper into the book and some of the themes, and also to ask questions directly to all 4 co-authors. So how the book club works is if you sign up, and it's totally free to sign up, we meet 4 times, 1 for each section written by a co-author. And when we meet virtually on Zoom to discuss that section, then that co-author calls in and you're able to ask all the burning questions that you may have come up with while you were reading. So those discussions have been really deep and personal. These guys are really personal questions, and they shine a lot of light on what it's like to be on death row and where they came from and what got them there, what gives them hope. So the book club is one of my favorite things to do. I'm definitely excited about the 2 upcoming events that we have left. The one on Thursday, the topic is defunding the police, and we're going to explain what that means and what it doesn't mean, some of the common misconceptions about that. So I'll be looking forward to that topic. And then the topic on June 30th is restorative justice and sort of what ideal criminal justice reform might look like. So that's another one that I think that people should tune in for. The last thing that I've been doing lately is, in light of all the events that have been happening, I just really think it's important for people to understand how each one of us, particularly if you're a white person, is like why we need to learn how to talk about racial issues and to understand racial issues better. So I'll be doing another book club with the book White Fragility, which I didn't write. That was Robin DeAngelo who wrote that. And anyone can join, and we'll just be trying to dive into really deep topics, like why is it so hard for us to talk about race? Why is it so hard for us to advance racial justice in this country? What are the ways in which we may be contributing to racial injustice without realizing it sometimes? And I would really love people to join me for that discussion. So if you want to talk about the White Fragility book, you can just email me, and I think Jessica just sent out the email. And also on my website, you can sign up for the Crimson Letters book club. And I hope to see everybody there.
Yes, so thank you again. Yes, I sent everyone a text in the chat with a link to Tessie's book club on her website, as well as her email if you want to contact her directly. Also, yes, someone had asked earlier, this will be available, the video of all of our events, this series and all of Greensboro Bound's virtual events will be available online. There will be a little bit of a lag in getting them up because I have to edit them and then post them, but that will be at greensboro-bound.com/virtual-events-library. You can see our first two author conversations, and then the rest of these Crimson Letters events will be there. Also, someone had asked about a must-read list on this topic. I will converse with Tessie offline to get her thoughts on that, and she may also come back to Dr. Baumgartner for his recommendations as far as must-read books on the topic of criminal justice reform. And then I'll share those on the Greensboro Bound Facebook page for you guys to access that. I think that'd be an easier way to have that in writing rather than just listing off books here. So again, thank you to our audience for tuning in. I do appreciate you spending some time with us as we kind of continue diving into this, this topic. Again, we do have 2 more conversations left next Thursday, the 25th, and then the following Tuesday, the 30th. Next Friday, which is June 19th, we will be speaking with James Shields and William Andrews. James Shields is a professor at Guilford College. He wrote a one-man play on the life of Frederick Douglass. Bill Andrews has written or collected slave narratives. And the 2 of them will be getting together with us next Friday, which also happens to be Juneteenth, which is the day that slavery was abolished, kind of seen as an Independence Day of sorts for slaves. So that is an important day and an important conversation to have on that date. That will be at 7 o'clock in the evening, again, here in the Zoom sphere. So everyone, again, thank you, Dr. Baumgartner. Thank you, Tessie, for your time. I really appreciate it. And Tessie, I'll see you next week. Everybody else, stay safe and have a good rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you.